Imagine a time when history feels less like a straight line and more like a circle, a pattern of building and breaking, remembering and forgetting. Beneath the world we know lies a silence, a drowned memory of civilizations that may have risen long before the ones recorded in our books. Geologists speak of ice ages, archaeologists unearth stones that seem too old for their carvings, and myths whisper of floods and golden ages when gods walked among humans. Could these stories be fragments of something real? An earlier chapter erased by the sudden cruelty of climate and the endless weight of time? The Younger Dryas, a 1,000-year winter, arrives not only as a scientific event, but as a shadow stretching across the imagination. It is the pause between ages, a great interruption where fire, ice, and water may have buried entire worlds of knowledge. What if the Atlantis of Plato, the Zep Tepi of Egypt, or the flood of Gilgamesh are not inventions, but distorted memories of what came before us? Tonight, we follow those traces, drifting between science and legend, to ask if humanity is older and more fragile than we ever believed. Welcome to Historic Sleep. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now. I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. The first sound is water, moving in places it has not touched for 50,000 years. Picture a ridge high above a valley, its stone ribs still polished smooth by glaciers that only recently surrendered their grip. Below, rivers carve impatient lines through newborn earth, foaming white as they discover paths into the lowlands. These currents are not ordinary. They are the dissolving voice of an age of ice, carrying away the memory of weight that pressed down like a lid upon the continent. Around their banks, marshlands shimmer, heavy with meltwater, and mastodons wade slowly through the shallows. Their tusks, curved like pale crescents, catch the sun. That sun feels different now, warmer, less hostile, as though the sky itself has chosen kindness after an age of severity. The air carries a perfume lost for millennia, damp earth mixed with shoots of grass that have not grown here in living memory. The sweet rot of fallen wood, the musk of animals returning to a world that seems young again. To the people who walked this land, these changes were more than weather. For generations, survival had been the only rhythm, each day a contest against cold that could snap bone and hunger that could hollow out families. They lived like shadows along the edge of glaciers, clinging to the brief summers when berries ripened and herds wandered close enough to hunt. Then, suddenly, the rules changed. Winters shortened, summers lingered, valleys bloomed with colors no ancestor had ever described. The world, for the first time in tens of thousands of years, felt abundant. To breathe was not to brace for scarcity, but to inhale possibility. Scientists today call this interval the Bulling Allerud, a name born in laboratories and ice cores. But to those alive within it, no terminology could have captured its wonder. Imagine children born into warmth, never knowing the terror of endless blizzards their parents endured. Imagine communities that did not need to wander so far, because rivers flowed steadily and animals grazed in predictable cycles. For the first time in uncounted generations, people could pause. They could stay long enough to watch seedlings become groves, long enough to bury their dead and find them still remembered in the same place seasons later. That pause was the beginning of something more profound than survival. It was the seed of culture. We cannot know their words, but we can sense their footsteps. Along riverbanks, clusters of shelters rose from timber and hide, sturdier than the temporary lean-tos of nomadic hunts. Storage pits dug into cool soil preserved grains and nuts through winters that now felt mild compared to the crushing cold before. And perhaps, somewhere, someone placed seeds deliberately in a row, noticing how growth followed pattern, how chance could be guided. The faint beginning of agriculture, the earliest whisper of domestication, may have stirred here. These small gestures, almost invisible to us, were revolutions to them. For the first time, life allowed experiments. What happens when human beings are given not just space to survive, but time to imagine? Myths may begin. The memory of endless struggle against snow would contrast so sharply with the gentleness of new summers that stories of divine intervention were inevitable. Later civilizations would call this kind of beginning a first time, a zeptepi in Egyptian tradition, when gods themselves taught humanity the arts of life. The Sumerians, thousands of years later, would look back to an antediluvian age of long-lived kings, ruled under the sky god Anu, when prosperity seemed unbroken. Even Plato, speaking of Atlantis in Greece, described not invention but recollection, a memory of a place older than history allowed. To the people of this golden window, there was no need for philosophy or metaphor. They were simply alive in abundance, and abundance felt like a miracle. Yet abundance can be deceptive. When conditions are gentle for long enough, permanence seems natural, and fragility hides beneath green leaves. The rivers looked eternal, the forests seemed endless, the warmth appeared as though it had always belonged, but history, like the seasons, never holds still for long. Beneath the roots of their settlements, the planet was preparing another transformation, one so sudden and merciless that it would unravel everything gained in 2,000 years of ease. Archaeologists dig through these moments in fragments, a flint blade too advanced for its supposed age, stones aligned with constellations requiring generations of observation, burial sites suggesting ritual complexity beyond what textbooks predict. Each artifact alone can be explained away. Together they form an echo, a suggestion that perhaps during this golden span, human society reached further than we dare imagine. If so, their story would be our first forgotten age, erased not by conquest or decline, but by the return of cold. For now, though, imagine only the warmth. A settlement beside a river, smoke curling from hearths of stone, children chasing each other through grasses taller than themselves. Hunters returning with game not to stave off famine, but to feed feasts. Elders telling stories that no longer end in warnings of death, but in visions of continuity. A world that, for a brief moment, allowed humanity to feel at home. This was the stage before the fall, the prologue to catastrophe, and perhaps the cradle of the myths that would survive long after memory itself was shattered. When ice begins to retreat, it does not simply vanish, it withdraws like a wounded animal, leaving scars across the earth. Behind the melting walls lay valleys gouged deep and wide, plains scoured of soil, and lakes that had never known sunlight before. These were not landscapes shaped gently by centuries of weather. They were raw, abrupt, as if the planet itself had been carved with blades. To those who first walked into these places, every horizon must have looked unfamiliar, a sketch of paradise drawn over the ruins of hardship. Rivers, once buried under glaciers, ran clear and full, carrying not only water but the promise of permanence. Where tundra once stretched gray and lifeless, wildflowers unfurled, their colors painting meadows that had not existed in living memory. In such a world, humans did not merely adapt, they began to dream of permanence. Imagine a band of hunter-gatherers pausing beside a river and realizing that fish swam here year after year, that deer followed the same trails season after season, that grains of wild barley grew in dependable clusters. They built sturdier shelters of timber and clay, structures not meant to be abandoned after a single winter. Fires were tended not just for warmth, but for cooking meals that could be shared in abundance. For the first time, survival was no longer the only rhythm. There was time to sing, to carve symbols, to pass along knowledge that stretched beyond immediate need. We know fragments of this era through the stories later civilizations preserved. In the earliest writings of Sumer, the kings who reigned before the flood are described as impossibly long-lived, ruling for thousands of years under the watch of divine figures. Egypt remembered its own beginning, the Zep Tepi, when beings of light and wisdom established order and taught astronomy, farming, and architecture. Greece carried the story of Atlantis, a maritime power built from white and red stone, so advanced that even the engineers of the Nile seemed humbled by its memory. These tales, separated by oceans and centuries, return again and again to the same motif. There was a time before, an age of knowledge, and it ended. Skeptics remind us that myths grow from the soil of imagination. Floods and fires happen everywhere, so stories of destruction emerge naturally. But one cannot ignore how consistently these traditions describe not just disaster, but a golden period that preceded it. Perhaps memory itself is more resilient than we imagine, carrying through oral tradition the faint outlines of a world that once was. And in those outlines we sense communities that may have reached complexity far earlier than textbooks allow. Stone tools that appear fully developed rather than slowly evolving. Megalithic structures aligned to stars with a precision that implies generations of observation. Patterns that do not fit comfortably within the narrative of slow, linear progress. Even in silence, the earth remembers. Sediment layers tell of sudden warming across the northern hemisphere, a shift so abrupt that winters shortened within a handful of generations. Tree pollen trapped in ancient mud shows forests springing to life almost overnight, their canopies spreading across landscapes that had known only ice. For humans, this was not geology. It was rebirth. Communities grew, children thrived, and for 2 millennia a fragile equilibrium held. We might call it a garden age, though it was never meant to last. There is something tragic in abundance. When the world grows generous, people begin to believe that generosity is eternal. Settlements flourished with little thought for catastrophe, because catastrophe felt like a memory belonging only to ancestors. Yet, beneath this new paradise, the climate system churned with instability. Ice sheets still clung to the far north, their vast weight pressing down on continents. Enormous lakes formed behind walls of ice, reservoirs waiting for the smallest crack. Volcanoes slept uneasily beneath green hills. Above, Fragments of comets and asteroids moved silently through black space, indifferent to the lives beneath them. We know now what they could not: that stability is never permanent. Around 12,900 years ago, the Earth turned with sudden cruelty. Temperatures plunged. The warmth that had nurtured 2,000 years of growth was snatched away within decades. In northern Europe, winters stretched so long that entire generations knew little else. In North America, forests that had flourished collapsed into tundra once more. Megafauna, the mammoths, the giant sloths, the saber-toothed cats, fell into decline, starving in environments they could not adapt to quickly enough. For human communities, the blow was devastating. Abundance vanished. The experiment of permanence collapsed. The golden window closed, and the age of ice returned. We call this the Younger Dryas, named for a small Arctic flower that suddenly appeared in places where it had no business growing. Its presence in sediment tells of climates colder and harsher than anything the warming period had suggested. To scientists, it is a data point, an anomaly in climate graphs. To those who lived through it, it was apocalypse. Imagine the shock of people who had been born into warmth, who had planted seeds with the expectation of harvest, now watching frost devour their crops, rivers freeze solid, and herds scatter beyond reach. Fires that once meant comfort now stood against endless winds. Stories turned from joy back to survival, from dreams of permanence back to desperate prayers. It is in this moment that legend and history blur most deeply. Later texts speak of floods, of divine punishment, of worlds destroyed and remade. Plato's Atlantis is swallowed by the sea in a single night of disaster. The Sumerian king lists divide their chronology sharply between the antediluvian rulers and everything that came after. Egypt places its first time in the age before calamity, as though admitting that something had been lost forever. Across continents, from the Americas to Asia, oral traditions tell of a before and an after, separated by catastrophe. The Younger Dryas was not just a climate event. It became a boundary in memory, a curtain drawn across whatever civilizations may have stirred in the warmth. Standing at the edge of this abyss, we are left with haunting questions. Did humanity rise once before, only to be cut down by forces too vast to resist? Were there cities now drowned beneath the seas that rose when glaciers collapsed? Did elders carry knowledge into exile, knowledge later remembered as gifts from gods or culture heroes? Or are we chasing shadows, mistaking natural cycles for evidence of lost ages? The truth remains buried in stone, in ice, in myths that refuse to fade. Yet the possibility that we are not the first to walk this path lingers, like frost glittering under a sun too weak to melt it. The 1,000-year winter did not arrive everywhere at once. It crept across the hemispheres unevenly, a strange contagion of cold that struck some lands like a hammer, while others lingered in strange in-between states. In northern Europe, the shift was brutal. Within a span no longer than a human life, summers shortened until they felt like weeks, and winters thickened until they swallowed 3/4 of the year. Families who had once planted in fertile soil found frost claiming their fields again and again. Rivers that had run clear through warm seasons grew sluggish with ice, their edges crusted white even beneath weak sunlight. Children born in this time did not remember the generosity of the golden window. Their lullabies were the howl of gales and the crack of frozen wood. But travel south and west, and the story changes. In the Iberian Peninsula, for a time, warmth remained. The skies stayed dry, the earth parched, and for centuries people lived in a cruel mirage where summers burned hot while neighbors to the north froze. Far across the Atlantic, in North America, forests that had stretched endlessly were undone by the sudden return of tundra. Where oak and elm had dominated for 2,000 years, bare grasses crept in, painting the land gray-green and thin. The great Laurentide ice sheet, which had been shrinking for millennia, stirred and surged south again, erasing in decades what warmth had gained in centuries. Blizzards carved across the plains, and mastodons, already weakened, staggered into decline. Yet in East Asia, the cold came late, hesitating for centuries. In Japan, pollen trapped in lake sediments tells us that trees held their ground, and warmth lingered long after Europe had already frozen solid. Only after 6 centuries did the climate there surrender to the same relentless chill. It was not one disaster, but a patchwork of calamities, a mosaic of climates rewired in ways that make little sense to us even now. Scientists call it an asynchronous event, but to those who endured it, labels meant nothing. They only knew that the familiar world had fractured, and survival no longer followed the rhythms of memory. The southern hemisphere avoided the crushing walls of ice, but its relief was brief. In South America, the Andes grew dry and brittle, ancient lakes shrinking until black layers of charcoal marked where massive wildfires consumed already stressed forests. Across East Africa, water bodies like Lake Victoria receded to dangerous lows, their shores cracking under relentless sun. Grasslands replaced wetlands, changing the lives of herds and the humans who followed them. And in Australia, rainfall surged, a paradox of plenty that destabilized ecosystems adapted to scarcity. Animals bred too fast, plants drowned in water they had never evolved to bear, and chaos unfolded not as cold, but as imbalance. Imagine being human in such a time. Your ancestors told stories of warmth, of plenty, of rivers that ran full, but your eyes saw frost, fire, drought, or flood depending on where fate placed you. Migration routes carved into tradition for generations no longer held. Animals that once returned faithfully to valleys did not appear. Rivers dried or froze. Storage pits that had preserved families through winters failed when seasons stretched too long or twisted out of order. People moved restlessly across the land, abandoning old settlements, carrying what they could, and leaving behind the rest. With movement comes story. Around firelight, survivors told of lands lost to snow, of forests turned to ash, of waters that betrayed their people. These stories, repeated through centuries, hardened into myths of destruction. In some versions, gods unleashed punishment. In others, demons clawed open the sky. Yet beneath the layers of symbolism lies the echo of lived experience. The earth itself had turned against its inhabitants, and all that had been built in 2,000 years of stability was dismantled in mere decades. Archaeology leaves us glimpses of this unraveling. Forests that died suddenly, their trees collapsing into what scientists now call forest cemeteries, where timber lay stacked and frozen in layers of permafrost. Bones of mammoths marked by stress fractures, teeth worn down as they struggled to extract meager nutrition from frozen soils. Campsites left abruptly, hearths cold, tools scattered as though their owners had fled in haste. To stand in such places today is to feel the presence of absence, the silence of people who had no time to say goodbye to the lives they once imagined permanent. The Younger Dryas was not a single winter. It was an age of endurance. For over 1,000 years, generations lived and died under skies that rarely softened. Children born into the cold did not believe in tales of warmth. They laughed at the idea of rivers flowing unfrozen, of forests so dense that light could barely pierce. For them, abundance was myth, survival the only truth. Knowledge carried from the golden window began to erode. Farming experiments ceased when frost devoured harvests. Complex tools were abandoned when mobility returned as necessity. Oral traditions shrank to practical advice: where to find shelter, which roots might still be edible, how to keep fire alive through nights when winds threatened to snuff it out. And yet not everything was lost. Humans are more than their circumstances. Even in despair, they carved, painted, and sang. Cave walls bear witness to creatures both real and imagined, etched by hands that had every reason to surrender, but chose expression instead. Perhaps art was defiance, a way of saying, even if the earth denies us, we remain. Or perhaps it was memory, an attempt to hold fragments of beauty against the onslaught of ice. Whatever the reason, those images endure, silent testimony that culture persists even when civilization falters. For us, the Younger Dryas is a scientific puzzle, a line on a graph, a disruption in climate models. But for those who lived it, it was the end of a world. Imagine the stories whispered into the ears of children, of a time when rivers flowed all year, when summers stretched long, when food grew plentiful, when the air itself seemed kind. To children staring at frozen horizons, such stories would feel like fairy tales, yet they were memories, distorted, fragile, but true. Those children grew into elders who passed the same tales on, and over centuries the line between memory and myth blurred until all that remained was legend. This is how the golden window became the first time, how drowned coastlines became Atlantis, how the collapse of forests became tales of divine judgment. Myths are not inventions. They are translations of survival. They carry the emotional truth of disaster, even when the factual details dissolve. And in their persistence, we glimpse the possibility that humanity's story is older, more fractured, and more cyclical than our histories admit. No great catastrophe arrives without a whisper first. The cold did not simply fall from the sky like a curtain. It was summoned, perhaps by forces hidden beneath the soil, perhaps by fire carried in from the stars, perhaps by water held back too long by walls of ice. To understand how the golden window closed, we must look not only at the people who endured it, but at the earth itself, the restless body upon which they built their fragile homes. One story begins with a mountain in what we now call Germany. For thousands of years it slept quietly beneath green hills, its crater filled with a still lake that mirrored the sky. To the people living nearby, it was nothing more than landscape, a peaceful backdrop to hunting grounds and gathering places, but deep beneath the surface, molten stone and gases pressed upward, impatient. Then, without warning, the mountain split apart. A column of ash rose 40 kilometers into the stratosphere, turning the sun into a pale, ghostly disk. Daylight dimmed, and a fine gray powder drifted down over fields, rivers, and shelters. This was the eruption of the Lacher Sea volcano, a cataclysm so violent that it reshaped not only the land, but the air itself. Imagine standing there as it began. The first tremors ripple through the ground. Birds scatter. The air grows thick with a metallic taste. Within hours, ash falls like snow, coating leaves until they turn brown, clogging streams until fish float belly up. Hunters return to find herds vanished, driven off by smoke and poisoned water. Families wrap cloth around their mouths, but the fine dust seeps in, scratching lungs, burning eyes. The eruption does not end in a day. It lingers in the air, spreads across continents, and drifts into the very lungs of the climate system. Sulfur dioxide rises into the stratosphere, reflecting sunlight back into space, dimming the warmth that had carried humanity through 2,000 years of stability. It is summer, but without a summer's heat. Crops fail, not because of frost yet, but because the sun itself grows weak. Modern science can see this event etched into ice cores from Greenland. Thin layers of ash, spikes of sulfur, chemical fingerprints left behind like a confession. The timing is uncanny. Just as the Younger Dryas begins, just as the 1,000-year winter takes hold. This eruption fills the sky with poison and shadow. It seems almost too perfect, as though the volcano alone had brought about the collapse. But nature rarely writes such simple stories. Volcanic winters, even the most devastating, do not last centuries. Tambora, in 1815, gave us the year without a summer, but the skies cleared within 3 years. Toba, 74,000 years ago, nearly drove humanity to extinction, yet its shadow lasted only decades. How, then, could Lacquer Sea have stretched darkness across 13 centuries? Perhaps it did not cause the Younger Dryas, but rather nudged the world already on the brink. The eruption may have been the trigger that set loose forces far greater than itself. But if not the volcano, then what? Another story points not to the earth beneath, but to the sky above. Imagine a night suddenly torn open by fire. A streak of light brighter than the moon, splitting into fragments, scattering across continents. Explosions in the atmosphere that turned forests to ash in an instant. Shock waves flattening herds of animals. In this vision, the Younger Dryas begins not with magma, but with a comet. In 2007, researchers proposed that fragments of a cosmic visitor struck or exploded over North America around 12,800 years ago. They pointed to microscopic diamonds formed under intense pressure, to tiny glass beads created only in unimaginable heat, to strange concentrations of rare metals like iridium and platinum in soils of that age. In layers of blackened earth across dozens of sites, they found charcoal and soot that suggested wildfires burning on a continental scale. To them, it was as though the heavens had loosed a shotgun blast upon the world, igniting forests, filling the air with smoke, and plunging the planet into a winter far deeper than volcanoes alone could achieve. The evidence is compelling, though not without doubt. Some scientists argue the black layers could simply be the remains of natural fires. Others insist the microscopic beads could form in less dramatic ways. No crater large enough to confirm such an impact has been found, though advocates suggest the strikes may have fallen on ice sheets, leaving little trace. Yet the idea endures, because it carries with it a power that feels mythic. It explains not just climate change, but the sudden extinction of mammoths, saber-tooths, and giant sloths, and perhaps the collapse of the Clovis culture in North America. It resonates with stories humanity still tells: fire from the sky, punishment from the heavens, worlds destroyed in a single night. So which is true, the mountain or the comet? Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. Perhaps they were simply sparks falling upon tinder already too dry. Beneath the ice sheets of North America lay another danger. Water. Vast glacial lakes, held back by frozen walls, waited like beasts behind cages. Chief among them was Lake Agassiz, a body of water larger than all the Great Lakes combined. For centuries it swelled, pressing harder against the ice. And then, suddenly, the dam failed. In a torrent lasting weeks, perhaps even days, more fresh water than the modern ocean could imagine poured into the North Atlantic. Fresh water floats atop salt water. It does not sink, and so it can choke the great conveyor belt of ocean currents that carries heat from the tropics northward. When Lake Agassiz spilled its contents, it may have silenced that conveyor, stopping the flow of warmth to Europe and plunging entire continents into winter. Unlike a volcano or a comet, this mechanism explains not only the sudden onset, but also the millennium-long persistence. The oceans themselves had turned against humanity, shifting into a mode of cold stability that endured until the balance was restored over 1,000 years later. Imagine the terror of seeing such a flood. The ground shakes, ice walls crack, and water surges with a roar louder than thunder. Forests are torn out by their roots, animals swept away, valleys drowned. And though the people of that time could not have known the science, they would have felt the consequence soon after. The warmth they had trusted was gone. The winters stretched on. The golden window closed. Which story is true? Perhaps all three. A volcano that darkened the sky, a comet that shattered the forests, a flood that silenced the oceans. Each alone might be survivable. Together they became apocalypse. The Younger Dryas was not one event, but a convergence, a moment when multiple forces aligned to erase the progress of millennia, and humanity, caught in the crossfire of fire, ice, and water, carried only fragments of memory forward. For those who lived through it, the Younger Dryas was not a scientific phenomenon, not a line in a graph or a shift in pollen records. It was the collapse of certainty. One generation grew up with summers that stretched like golden rivers, with harvests that seemed reliable, with rivers that fed their fields and herds. The next watched those same rivers choke with ice, the ground grow stubborn and barren, the sky offer storms where once it had given rain. It is one thing to struggle against hunger in a world already cruel. It is another to lose paradise after you have tasted it. The elders must have told stories of the warmth, insisting to their children that the world had once been different. But to a boy chasing hares across frozen grasslands, or a girl carrying wood through snow that reached her knees, those stories would have sounded like fantasies. How could rivers run unfrozen for months? How could trees cover valleys so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground? To them, the tales of abundance felt like dreams of another universe. Yet those dreams endured, repeated in whispers, kept alive around firelight, softened and reshaped until they became myths. The myths tell us more than we realize. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh preserves the story of a flood that destroyed the world, sparing only one chosen family. In India, tales of Manu speak of a cosmic deluge that forced humanity to begin anew. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive waters that erase an earlier age. In the Americas, countless tribes recall the day when great waters swallowed the land, when their ancestors climbed mountains or floated in canoes to escape. These stories, separated by oceans, share the same bones: divine warning, catastrophe, survival, renewal. Perhaps they are not coincidences, but fractured memories of the same shattering event. When the climate turned, survival demanded change. Communities that had grown comfortable in fertile valleys abandoned them. Storage pits that had worked for centuries now lay empty. Hunting became desperate, with herds disappearing or migrating along new, unpredictable paths. Families carried what they could, sometimes only tools and firestones, leaving behind shelters and graves. Wanderers met wanderers, strangers collided on trails, and out of those collisions new traditions were born. Some chose to fight, others shared food and stories, binding themselves into new groups. And always, the past grew heavier, the memory of what had been lost. It is in these long journeys, under skies both freezing and untrustworthy, that myth took on sharper shapes. Divine punishment offered an explanation for suffering no one could otherwise make sense of. Floods, fires, or gods of judgment became ways to answer the unanswerable. Why had the world betrayed them? Rituals developed to appease unseen forces. Ceremonies meant to coax the return of warmth, or to keep the storms at bay. Stones were stacked in patterns, fires lit at sacred times, offerings buried in the ground. We call these gestures superstition, but they were acts of survival. To feel powerless in the face of an endless winter is to grasp at anything that offers meaning. And yet, even within catastrophe, there were sparks of resilience. Archaeologists uncover evidence of art, beads carved from bone, symbols etched into stone, pigments painted on walls. In the dark, people still sought beauty. Perhaps this was not frivolous. Beauty was a way to carry memory forward, to remind each generation that life was more than endurance. A carving of a mammoth on a cave wall was not just art. It was proof to children that such creatures had walked the land, even if the beasts were gone by the time those children grew. But endurance has a cost. As centuries dragged on, much of what had been learned during the Golden Window dissolved. Farming experiments ended. Knowledge that required permanence could not be passed down in a world of constant movement. Oral traditions shrank to fragments, and fragments decayed into symbols. When warmth finally returned, the people who emerged from the long winter were not blank slates, but neither were they the heirs of all that had been built before. They carried whispers, half-remembered lessons, and myths that preserved the shape of truth without its details. This is the paradox of the Younger Dryas. It destroyed, but it also preserved. It stripped humanity back to survival, yet in doing so, it seeded resilience. The very myths born from loss became blueprints for rebuilding. When the ice finally melted and rivers ran strong again, those myths carried instructions disguised as stories. Prepare for disaster. Value knowledge. Preserve memory. Because the world can change in a single lifetime. Imagine one such moment. A family huddled in a shelter of hide and bone, snow thickening outside. An elder tells the children of a time when the world was green, when people built homes that lasted, when herds roamed without fear of famine. The children listen, skeptical but fascinated. To them, it is myth. To the elder, it is memory. Between those two perceptions lies the seed of civilization itself. For when warmth finally returned, those children's descendants would try again. guided not by perfect knowledge, but by the persistent echo of a lost golden age. Perhaps this is why nearly every culture preserves some tale of a world that ended and began again. They are not warnings from gods, but testimonies from survivors. And in those testimonies lies the suggestion that humanity has already lived through cycles of creation and destruction more than once. We do not remember them as history. We remember them as myth. But myth, like frost patterns on glass, still carries the outline of what was once real. The animals had always been there. For tens of thousands of years, humans shared the world with giants, creatures so immense they seemed like moving landscapes. Mammoths trudged across frozen plains with the patience of mountains, their tusks arching skyward like pale moons. Saber-toothed cats stalked valleys, their fangs glinting with a menace that kept even the bravest hunters wary. Ground sloths the size of elephants lumbered through forests, pulling down entire branches with their slow, deliberate hunger. Giant beavers built lodges that rose like huts, while armored glyptodons, distant cousins of armadillos, moved like living boulders. To the first humans who spread into these lands, they were not just animals. They were neighbors, competitors, threats, and sometimes, if fortune allowed, sustenance. But then the cold deepened, and the giants began to vanish. The Younger Dryas was merciless to creatures that had thrived in balance with warmer climates. In North America alone, more than 80% of large mammal species disappeared. Mammoths grew thin, their bones etched with signs of malnutrition. Saber-toothed cats, deprived of prey, vanished entirely. Horses that had galloped across the continent for millions of years collapsed into extinction, as did camels that once grazed on the same plains. It was as if the world's great bestiary had been erased, leaving only ghosts in the soil and legends in the minds of survivors. Why did they die? The question still stirs debate among scientists today. Some argue that climate alone delivered the fatal blow. The cold returned too swiftly, ecosystems shifted too harshly, and species too specialized could not adapt in time. Others point to humans, whose hunting techniques had sharpened in the golden window. A spear thrown by a skilled hand, or a coordinated drive into a ravine, could fell beasts that had once seemed invincible. Perhaps it was both, a partnership of cold and hunger, of ice and human persistence that erased the giants. For the people who watched it happen, the loss was more than ecological. It was spiritual. To share the earth with such creatures was to live in a world where every horizon promised awe. A hunter who killed a mammoth brought back not just meat, but a story that would echo for generations. The disappearance of these animals left more than empty stomachs. It left a hole in imagination. In myths that followed, the memory of giants lingers, gods with tusks, monsters with claws, beings so vast they shake the ground when they walk. Perhaps they were not inventions, but recollections of real creatures fading into memory as ice and hunger closed the age of giants. In the soil, their absence is clear. Sediment layers record sudden die-offs. Vast bone beds appear, places where entire herds collapsed, their remains frozen in positions of struggle. Some tusks bear strange markings, as though carved not just by teeth, but by fire and blade. Archaeologists have uncovered bones with cut marks, suggesting that humans scavenged or hunted the final populations. it is difficult to ignore the overlap between the spread of humans across continents and the disappearance of megafauna. Wherever people arrived, the giants seemed to vanish soon after. Was it coincidence or causation? Yet extinction did not mean complete erasure. In human stories, the giants live on. The Nephilim of Hebrew texts, towering beings wiped out by a flood. The Jotnar of Norse myth, ancient frost giants locked in struggle with the gods. The Titans of Greek legend, immense forces bound beneath the earth after losing their war against Zeus. Even in the Americas, indigenous traditions recall mammoths as thunder beings, their steps echoing in storms, their bones carrying sacred power. Myths, like fossils, are traces. They remind us that what seems impossible may simply be forgotten. For humans in the Younger Dryas, the loss of giants reshaped survival itself. Smaller animals replaced great herds. Hunters turned to deer, boar, and birds. Fishing became more crucial as rivers froze and thawed in erratic cycles. Communities had to adapt their tools, shifting from heavy weapons designed for mammoth hunts to more delicate points suited for nimble prey. The rhythm of life changed. No longer did a single kill feed a village for months. Now survival required constant effort, constant movement, constant recalculation of where food might appear. Imagine the psychological toll. To wake each morning and know that the land no longer held the beasts that had defined your ancestors' lives. To tell your children stories of animals they would never see, animals that to them sounded like creatures of dream. In that transformation, humanity itself changed. Without giants, we became the giants. Our ingenuity, our persistence, our ability to shape the environment became the dominant force. Some scholars suggest this was the moment when humans began to see themselves not as part of the world, but as its masters. Yet mastery is fragile. The Younger Dryas reminded humanity that even when predators vanish and prey grows scarce, survival is never guaranteed. The cold was a predator all its own, and it did not tire. In this crucible, humans were tested more harshly than ever before. They learned to endure long winters with little game, to craft clothing from thinner hides, to store food more carefully, to cooperate in ways that magnified their chance of survival. The giants had fallen, but humanity endured, reshaped into something tougher, something more inventive. Perhaps that is why, when warmth finally returned, the survivors did not begin from nothing. They carried with them knowledge honed in hardship, how to track seasons, how to preserve memory in symbols, how to imagine abundance even when surrounded by scarcity. They emerged into a warming world, carrying not just tools, but stories, the stories of giants lost, of winters that did not end, of floods and fires and divine retribution. These stories, half memory and half myth, became the foundation stones upon which new civilizations would later be built. In that sense, the extinction of the megafauna was not just a loss, it was also a transfer of weight. The mantle of dominance shifted from the beasts of the earth to the fragile, persistent hands of humanity. And in that shift lies the beginning of the world we recognize. A world where humans, for the first time, stood alone as the shapers of destiny, haunted by the shadows of giants they had outlived but never truly forgotten. The earth was restless, and so were its people. As ice crept back across the continents and herds vanished into extinction, communities could no longer remain where their ancestors had lived for generations. Families packed what little they could carry, Stone tools, fire starters, bone needles, charms of shell or carved ivory, and set out in search of food, warmth, and safety. The age of wandering returned, not as adventure, but as necessity. Trails stretched across frozen valleys, over mountains, and along rivers swollen with meltwater. The map of humanity was rewritten by migration, each step leaving faint traces in stone flakes, hearth ash, and forgotten footprints pressed into ancient mud. Some moved south, following the memory of warmth. Across Europe, people abandoned lands swallowed by tundra, drifting toward Mediterranean shores, where the climate remained less cruel. There, forests still offered game, and seas gave fish that could be dried or smoked for lean months. Along the Nile, settlements clung to the river as though it were a lifeline, its steady floods providing one of the rare consistencies in an unstable age. Farther east, bands of people threaded through the hills of the Levant, carrying with them seeds of barley and wheat, not yet fully domesticated, but familiar enough to scatter in new soils. These journeys were not aimless. They followed old instincts and new hopes, guided by stories of places where survival might still be possible. Other groups turned toward innovation instead of flight. In Anatolia, high plateaus offered rocky shelters where people carved out lives in stone. At sites like Göbekli Tepe, circles of massive pillars rose against the horizon, each etched with animals that had vanished or soon would. Why build such monuments in a time of hunger? Perhaps because memory itself had become precious. To carve a fox, a vulture, or a lion into stone was to resist forgetting, to insist that these beings still lived in the world of story, even if they no longer walked the land. These sanctuaries were not cities, not yet, but they were gathering places, nodes where scattered people came together, shared rituals, exchanged knowledge, and carried fragments of culture forward through the storm. In the Americas, migration unfolded on a continental scale. Population spread south from the ice-shadowed north, reaching into valleys and coasts where climates remained gentler. Along the Pacific shores, people fished and gathered shellfish, leaving behind middens that still whisper of their meals. Inland, groups tracked deer and smaller game, adapting tools and strategies as the megafauna faded. Some traditions speak of great journeys across mountains, of families who carried fire with them as they walked into new lands. These stories, passed down for thousands of years, may echo the migrations of the Younger Dryas, when necessity drove humans into unfamiliar territories, forcing them to adapt with each step. Every migration carried more than bodies. It carried memory. Families brought with them myths of floods and fires, tales of ancestors who had endured, warnings that the world could change without mercy. Around new hearths, those stories gained fresh details, shaped by the landscapes in which they were told. In one place, the flood became a memory of rivers bursting their banks. In another, it became the sea rising without end. In one valley, divine punishment took the form of fire falling from the sky. In another, of storms that never ceased. Each retelling preserved both the fear and the resilience of those who had lived through catastrophe. Migration also reshaped human identity. To move constantly is to meet others, and to meet others is to blend. Languages borrowed words, tools exchanged hands, customs merged. What had once been isolated bands became networks of memory, carrying fragments of culture across entire continents. Even in the harshest times, people found ways to share, seeds, stories, songs, creating a continuity that endured long after the cold itself passed. The very act of migration, though born from necessity, became the mechanism through which humanity survived, not just physically, but culturally. Imagine one such encounter. A band of wanderers approaches a river valley where another group has already settled. Suspicion rises first, for scarcity sharpens fear. But then hunger outweighs hostility, and they trade. Dried fish for stone blades, furs for seeds. Around a shared fire, stories emerge, each group recounting their version of the world's collapse. They discover that though details differ, the pattern is the same. Warmth lost, floods rising, hunger pressing in. In that moment, strangers become kin through shared catastrophe, and the memory of disaster becomes a bond stronger than blood. The migrations of the Younger Dryas also planted seeds, literal and symbolic, that would blossom when warmth finally returned. As people carried wild grains into new lands, they learned which soils welcomed them, which climates allowed them to grow. Though farming could not take root fully in the long winter, the knowledge did not vanish. It lingered, waiting for the sun to return. When it did, those scattered seeds of memory would germinate into the first fields of agriculture, the first true villages, the first empires. But in the thick of the Younger Dryas, the future was invisible. All that mattered was survival. People learned to read the sky for subtle changes, to notice when winds shifted, to sense when ice would thicken or thaw. They became watchers of nature in ways deeper than we can imagine today, attuned to every tremor of climate because their lives depended on it. That vigilance entered their myths as well. Gods of storm and frost, spirits of rivers and mountains, deities whose moods reflected the fragile balance of the world. These were not abstractions. They were ways of naming forces that dictated whether a family would live or starve. Through all this, resilience was not just endurance. It was adaptation. Humans did not merely wait for the cold to pass. They reshaped themselves around it. They became more mobile, more inventive, more cooperative. And in the crucible of hardship, they carried forward the most vital resource of all, the memory that worlds can change. It was a lesson carved into their very being, one that would shape the civilizations to come. When ice melts, it does not retreat quietly. It collapses in torrents, in walls of water that roar across valleys and crush forests beneath their weight. During the Younger Dryas and its final thaw, this truth revealed itself again and again. Lakes dammed by glaciers burst in sudden fury, releasing floods that reshaped continents in days. Rivers carved new courses, canyons deepened overnight, and entire landscapes vanished under waves. To those who witnessed it, the world must have seemed alive, turning against them in moments of incomprehensible violence. One such flood is remembered in whispers carved into the land of North America. The great ice sheet that covered the north held back colossal reservoirs of water, and when its walls fractured, whole valleys drowned. The Missoula floods, as we name them now, were not gentle. Imagine a lake the size of several modern states breaking loose, its waters rushing faster than any river we know, stripping soil to bedrock, tossing boulders the size of houses as if they were driftwood. For the people camped along those valleys, there would have been no escape. Campsites, hearths, and memories were swept away in a single surge. To survive such an event was to inherit a memory that could never be forgotten. Elsewhere, as the Younger Dryas came to its end, seas began to rise with a relentlessness that defied imagination. Meltwater poured into oceans, and shorelines retreated year after year, swallowing coasts where generations had once lived. In Southeast Asia, fertile plains now lie beneath the South China Sea, drowned beneath hundreds of feet of water. Along the shores of India, legends still tell of cities lost to the ocean, their walls visible only when the tide withdraws. Across the Mediterranean, stories endure of islands swallowed whole, of lands that sank in storms. We may dismiss them as imagination, but beneath the waves, sonar reveals ancient riverbeds, coastlines where people once walked. The most famous of these stories belongs to Greece, where Plato spoke of Atlantis, a powerful island civilization undone in a single night by floods and earthquakes. Scholars argue over whether he meant allegory or memory, philosophy or history, but perhaps both are true. For survivors watching coastlines vanish and seas claim their homes, it must have felt as though the earth itself had judged them. Their world did not end with fire from the sky, but with water rising unstoppable, a punishment delivered by nature itself. To pass down that trauma as story was not invention, but survival, a way of remembering that the sea is never permanent, that land can vanish. In Mesopotamia, where the rivers Tigris and Euphrates nourished early settlements, flood myths became central to culture. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim, warned by the gods to build a vessel, preserving life as waters consumed the land. In the Hebrew tradition, Noah becomes the chosen survivor, his ark a cradle for renewal. In India, Manu is guided by a divine fish to build a boat that saves humanity. These tales are not copies of one another, but echoes of the same truth. The world was drowned, and only fragments of humanity endured. Across continents, from the Andes to Polynesia, from Africa to the far north, variations of this memory persist. The flood is the most universal myth, because the flood was the most universal experience. Imagine standing on a shoreline that your grandfather once farmed, watching each year as the sea moves closer. First it takes the fields, then it takes the huts, then it swallows the burial grounds where your ancestors rest. The sea is not merely water. It becomes a thief of memory, erasing evidence of lives lived, carrying them into depths where they cannot be retrieved. For people of the Younger Dryas, the sea was a devouring force, and the only defense was to carry its story into the future so that descendants would know land can drown. Archaeologists searching the seafloor today find hints of these forgotten worlds. Off the coast of India, near Dwarka, structures lie beneath the waves, too regular to be mere stone outcrops. In the North Sea, what was once a vast plain known as Doggerland now rests beneath cold waters, its rivers and hills mapped only by sonar. In the Persian Gulf, drowned valleys suggest places where people once lived, now buried under salt. Each discovery lends weight to the myths, reminding us that memory sometimes outlives evidence, and that legend can be truer than history dares admit. But floods were more than destruction. They were also transformation. When people fled rising waters, they carried with them seeds, tools, and stories. They spread inland, up river valleys, onto higher ground. In their exile they met others, exchanged knowledge, and formed the beginnings of networks that would one day shape civilizations. The flood scattered humanity, but it also connected it. To tell your children that the world was once drowned is to give them a warning, but also a lesson in resilience. We survived, and you will too. Perhaps that is why the flood myth is always double-edged. It speaks of annihilation, but also of renewal. The old world is washed away, but from the survivors comes a new age. The ark lands on a mountain. The boat drifts to safety. The waters recede, and life begins again. For cultures emerging from the Younger Dryas, this was more than metaphor. It was their reality. They had seen lands destroyed, but they had also seen themselves endure. In the story of the flood lies the story of humanity itself. Fragile, swept away by forces greater than us, yet always carrying forward the spark of continuity. So when we read of Atlantis, or Noah, or Manu, or Utnapishtim, perhaps we are not reading separate tales at all. Perhaps we are hearing the many voices of a single event, told in different languages, shaped by different landscapes, but born of the same memory. A memory of water rising, of worlds lost, of survival carried forward in fragile boats of wood and in even more fragile vessels of story. When the waters receded and the skies softened, humanity emerged into a world remade. Forests grew back across valleys, rivers found new paths, and the ice, though still heavy in the north, began to surrender its grip. But the people who stepped into this renewed landscape were not the same as those who had once lived through the golden window. They carried scars, physical, emotional, and cultural. Their myths had grown sharper, filled with the memory of loss, and in those myths a new theme appeared. The arrival of teachers, beings who came after the flood to restore what had been forgotten. Everywhere the stories take similar shapes. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians spoke of Oans, a being who rose from the sea in the form of a man with the tail of a fish. He taught writing, mathematics, agriculture, and the arts of civilization before returning to the waters at night. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, brought knowledge of corn, astronomy, and calendars. In Egypt, Thoth, the ibis-headed god, was credited with language, law, and the sciences. Greece spoke of Prometheus, who defied the gods to bring fire and knowledge to humankind. Different names, different guises, yet the same pattern. Culture itself did not arise naturally, but was bestowed, as if from survivors of an earlier world. Why would so many cultures remember their beginnings this way? One explanation is simple myth-making. Humans, uncertain of their own ingenuity, ascribed their breakthroughs to divine gifts. But another possibility is that real survivors, remnants of societies shattered by the Younger Dryas, wandered among less disrupted peoples, carrying fragments of their knowledge. To those who had only ever lived in small bands of hunters, such survivors might have seemed like gods. A person who knew how to shape stone into temples, how to measure the sky, how to plant seeds in careful rows, would not have been seen as merely skilled, but as touched by the divine. Consider Göbekli Tepe, on the high plains of Anatolia. There, 12,000 years ago, people erected vast circles of carved stone pillars, each taller than a man, some weighing more than 10 tons. The stones are etched with animals, foxes, snakes, vultures, and arranged with astronomical precision. Yet this site predates agriculture, predates permanent villages, predates what we think of as civilization itself. Who gathered the knowledge to build such monuments? Who organized the labor, designed the alignments, carved the symbols? Archaeologists argue, but the site itself whispers of memory, as though survivors of an earlier age sought to anchor their knowledge in stone before it could vanish again. The same pattern repeats elsewhere. Across the Andes, megalithic walls at sites like Sacsayhuaman and Tiwanaku display a precision of stone cutting that even later cultures struggled to replicate. In Egypt, myths tell of the Zep Tepi, the first time, when gods walked the earth and laid the foundations of temples. In Polynesia, travelers spoke of Maui fishing islands out of the sea, gifting navigation and survival to his people. In each case, knowledge is framed not as discovery, but as recovery. Gifts from beings who remembered a time before. Imagine a band of wanderers emerging from catastrophe, carrying with them fragments of old techniques. They know how to watch the stars because their ancestors once relied on constellations to mark seasons. They know how to move massive stones because they have seen it done before. They know stories of floods and fire because they lived them. To the people they meet, who have no memory of such things, these wanderers would seem supernatural. And yet, they are only human, human-shaped by loss, driven by memory, determined to rebuild what they can before the knowledge disappears forever. In myths, these figures are often ambivalent. They are teachers, but they are also dangerous, sometimes punished for sharing their gifts. Prometheus is chained to a rock for giving fire to mortals. Quetzalcoatl is exiled, fated to return. Oannes belongs to the sea, not to the land he blesses. Perhaps this reflects an ancient truth, that survivors who carried fragments of lost knowledge were never fully understood, never entirely trusted. They were different, belonging to a vanished age, and so memory clothed them in both awe and suspicion. For the survivors themselves, the act of teaching may have been desperation. To carry knowledge is to feel its weight. What use is astronomy if no one else can read the stars? What use is agriculture if no one knows how to tend crops? Knowledge must be shared, or it dies. To carve animals into stone, to align pillars with solstices, to tell stories of gods who gave wisdom. These may have been ways to plant seeds, not just in soil, but in memory. Seeds that could grow again when the world was ready. The idea of culture bringers also speaks to a deeper human truth. That memory often survives best when clothed in myth. A story of a god who gave laws endures longer than a list of statutes. A tale of a divine teacher who brought crops carries more weight than a simple description of farming. Myth becomes a vessel, durable enough to cross millennia, carrying within it the fragile cargo of memory. When we read of Oannes, or Quetzalcoatl, or Thoth, we may not be reading about gods at all, but about people who survived catastrophe and became myth so that their knowledge could survive with them. And so the Younger Dryas did not only destroy, it also transformed. It scattered humanity across continents, but in doing so, it carried with it fragments of older knowledge that were reborn as gifts from gods. It erased civilizations, perhaps, but seeded the foundations of new ones. Out of the scars of the long winter came myths of culture bringers, stories that still echo in temples, in texts, in songs. Whether divine or human, their legacy is the same. Memory endured. And through memory, so did we. When the world shifts beneath your feet, when winters last longer than memory and floods erase the land where your ancestors are buried, you begin to look upward. The ground is no longer reliable. Rivers change their courses, forests wither, ice advances and retreats with a cruelty beyond comprehension. But the sky, silent, distant, unchanging in its patterns, offers something else. The stars rise and fall in rhythms that survive even the longest winters. The moon waxes and wanes, though empires collapse. The sun still returns, though sometimes its warmth falters. For the survivors of the Younger Dryas, the heavens became more than backdrop. They became a book, a teacher, a warning. It is no coincidence that some of the earliest monuments built after the long winter are aligned to the sky. At Göbekli Tepe, the stone circles orient toward constellations that would have marked solstices and equinoxes. Carvings of animals may represent star clusters, turning memory into cosmology. At Nabta Playa, in the Nubian desert, standing stones erected over 7,000 years ago align with the rising of Sirius, the star that later guided Egyptians in predicting the Nile flood. In Britain, long before Stonehenge, wooden posts and circular ditches were arranged to track the movements of the sun. These were not idle curiosities. They were acts of survival, attempts to predict the unpredictable by tethering life to the eternal sky. Imagine a community gathering at night after months of cold. The fire burns low, the children huddle close, and an elder raises a hand toward the heavens. There, she points to a cluster of stars, explaining that when these appear above the horizon, warmth will follow. Another star marks the return of rain. A third warns of the shortening of days. These teachings are not abstractions, but instructions, carved into memory so that food may be gathered, seeds planted, journeys planned. In such lessons, astronomy was born, though cloaked in story and sacredness. Over generations, the sky became a canvas upon which entire mythologies were painted. Constellations were not random scatterings of light, but beings of power. Hunters, serpents, birds, lions. Their stories encoded seasonal cycles, reminding each generation when to move, when to plant, when to prepare for scarcity. In this way, memory of catastrophe was transformed into ritual. To watch the stars was not merely curiosity, it was to safeguard survival. But beyond the cycles of seasons, the heavens also held memory of disaster. Some myths describe stars falling, fire raining from the sky, gods hurling lightning that destroyed the world. Perhaps these were recollections of meteor showers, or of the cosmic event that some believe triggered the Younger Dryas. In the constellations, survivors may have inscribed warnings. Here is where the danger came from. Here is when it might return. The sky was both comfort and terror, both clock and prophecy. Across cultures, we see the same reverence for celestial order. In Sumer, priests tracked the movements of planets, believing they held divine messages. In Mesoamerica, the Maya developed calendars of astonishing precision, linking cosmic cycles to earthly fate. In Egypt, temples were aligned to solstices, the rising sun illuminating sacred chambers only on specific days. In all these cases, astronomy and religion were inseparable. To look at the stars was to commune with gods, but also to hold on to the memory of a fragile, changeable world. What if this fascination with the sky did not begin in flourishing cities, but in the long night of the Younger Dryas? When winters stretched endlessly, people would have turned their gaze upward, seeking signs of hope. When fire streaked across the heavens, they would have seen omens of destruction. Over centuries, these impressions hardened into tradition, so that when warmth returned, sky watching was already sacred. Civilizations did not invent astronomy. They inherited it, clothed in myth, polished by ritual, passed down by survivors who had stared at the heavens in desperation. Consider how memory works. To pass along knowledge across centuries, you must weave it into something memorable. A list of star positions will vanish in a generation. But a story of a serpent winding across the sky, of a hunter chasing prey, of twins who guard the seasons, these endure. The myths we still know, the constellations we still trace, may carry within them the instructions of people who lived through the last great upheaval. In their stories, catastrophe is preserved, wrapped in symbols we still repeat each night when we look upward. Even today, echoes remain. The Pleiades cluster, known worldwide, is almost universally associated with beginnings, planting, or flood warnings. From Greece to Japan, from the Americas to Australia, the Seven Sisters are tied to cycles of survival. How did such a motif spread so far? Perhaps because it was already ancient when humanity scattered after the Younger Dryas, already embedded in memory as a beacon that promised change. The sky also offered something else, a sense of permanence. To people whose lands drowned, whose animals vanished, whose winters lengthened without end, the stars were proof that not everything changed. Even as floods swept away valleys, Orion still rose, Sirius still burned, the moon still grew and shrank. In a world of collapse, that permanence was sacred. To align a temple with the solstice was to anchor human life to something greater than chaos. It was an act of defiance, of hope, of continuity. And so, as civilizations grew from the ashes of the long winter, the heavens became their scripture. Kings ruled by the stars, priests studied the skies, architects built monuments that mirrored constellations. Beneath all of it lay the memory of a time when the world fell apart and the sky was the only reliable guide. Astronomy was not born of luxury. It was born of survival. And in its sacred stories, we can still hear the echo of a humanity that once stood at the edge of extinction, looking upward for answers. When the Younger Dryas ended, it ended swiftly, almost violently in its kindness. In less than a generation, the cold that had held the world in its grip for over 1,000 years loosened, and the planet surged into warmth. Ice retreated with astonishing speed. Glaciers that had seemed eternal began collapsing. Rivers rushed free, and the air softened in a way no one alive could remember. For people whose entire lives had been defined by endurance, it must have felt like awakening in another world. The land they had cursed now offered abundance again, and for the first time in centuries, survival was no longer the only thought. Archaeologists see this shift clearly in the record. In the Levant, villages that had been temporary became permanent. At sites like Jericho and Sionu, people built stone houses with plastered walls, their shapes circular at first, then rectangular as generations refined them. Fire pits became ovens, and storage pits deepened, designed not just for a season but for years. The world of constant wandering gave way to settlement, and with settlement came experiment. Seeds of barley and wheat, long gathered from the wild, were now sown deliberately. Some failed, some thrived, and slowly farming took root. The first gardens of humanity were fragile, but they were beginnings, and beginnings mattered more than certainty. To imagine these early farmers is to imagine people both haunted and hopeful. They had survived a millennium of cold. They remembered hunger. They remembered winters that did not end. When they planted, they did not do so with blind optimism but with caution, aware that the earth could betray them again. Perhaps that is why so many rituals grew around the act of sowing. Songs to the soil, prayers to the rain, ceremonies for the sun. Farming was not only labor, it was faith, a belief that the cycle of seasons could once again be trusted. Every seed in the ground was both food and memory, a quiet defiance against the chaos of the past. The first fields transformed communities. Hunting bands that once scattered across valleys now stayed together, bound by the shared work of planting, tending, and harvesting. Children grew up in the same place as their parents, and elders were buried beneath homes rather than abandoned in distant camps. Stability brought new forms of memory. Families began to count years by harvests, to trace ancestry not through journeys but through place. Walls rose to protect storage, and with walls came a sense of permanence. In those walls, the dream of civilization stirred. But the memory of catastrophe never vanished. Myths of floods and long winters remained, whispered into each generation. They shaped the way people saw the land, not as a gift to be taken for granted, but as a force that could turn without warning. In Sumer, the king lists divide history into before and after the flood, as though acknowledging that human time itself had been cleaved in two. In Egypt, the Zep Tepi marked not just a beginning, but a re-beginning, the first time after an ending. The past was never forgotten. It was transformed into myth, ensuring that no one could live in comfort without also fearing collapse. This tension gave birth to culture. To live with both hope and dread is to seek meaning, and meaning found expression in ritual, art, and story. Temples rose alongside fields, not only as places to honor gods, but as attempts to anchor stability in stone. Priests and shamans became guardians of memory, interpreting the sky, predicting floods, preserving stories that warned of cycles. The trauma of the Younger Dryas had carved itself so deeply into humanity that even in times of plenty, we built reminders that order was fragile. Perhaps this is why so many early religions focus on balance between chaos and creation, between flood and drought, between gods who destroy and gods who give. The return of warmth also brought new abundance. Rivers swelled, fish multiplied, and animals returned in numbers unseen for centuries. But they were not the giants of old. The mammoths, the saber-tooths, the giant sloths, those remained gone, preserved only in story. Instead, smaller creatures thrived, and humans adapted with them. Sheep, goats, and cattle began to be herded, first as moving stores of meat, later as companions in settlement. Domestication was not an invention, but an adaptation, born from the need to secure food in a world where giants no longer walked. Each animal tamed was another safeguard against the return of hunger. Imagine a village at this dawn of renewal. Fields of barley ripple in a warm breeze. Children chase goats along pathways between stone huts. Elders sit at the thresholds, telling stories of winters so long the rivers froze solid, of floods that swallowed valleys, of gods who brought knowledge from the sea. The listeners laugh, not because they doubt the tales, but because the sun warms their skin and the harvest looks good. And yet, deep down, they believe. The stories remain because they are true, not as literal accounts, but as warnings carved into the heart of culture. For the archaeologist, the end of the Younger Dryas is the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution, the shift from hunting and gathering to farming and settlement. For those who lived it, it was something more profound. the return of trust in the earth. After 1,000 years of betrayal, the world seemed stable again. The warmth endured not for decades, but for centuries, long enough for children to forget the cold, long enough for grandchildren to laugh at flood stories, long enough for entire generations to believe that stability was natural. And yet, in every temple, in every myth, the shadow remained. Civilization was being born, not in innocence, but in the memory of catastrophe. That dual inheritance, hope and fear, still lingers with us. We plant fields with confidence, yet we build myths of floods. We celebrate abundance, yet we imagine apocalypse. We trust in stability, yet we prepare for its collapse. It is the legacy of the Younger Dryas, etched into the first seeds, the first walls, the first stories of gods and beginnings. Civilization rose from the ashes of catastrophe, always aware that the earth could one day remind us how fragile we truly are. The return of warmth did more than allow seeds to grow. It allowed stories to root themselves in stone. For centuries, memory had lived only in voices, carried by travelers across tundra and flood, fragile as breath. But now, with the earth steady enough to stay in one place, humanity began to carve permanence into the world around them. Fields became villages, villages became gathering centers, and soon those centers were more than practical. They were sacred. At Göbekli Tepe, the great stone circles rose against the Anatolian sky. Massive pillars stood arranged like guardians, each etched with animals, foxes leaping, vultures stretching wings, serpents winding as if alive. These creatures were not decorations. They were symbols, memories carved into limestone, so that future generations would never forget the world before. Archaeologists still puzzle over why hunter-gatherers built such monumental structures before agriculture had fully matured. But perhaps the answer is simple: because memory demanded it. After 1,000 years of chaos, to carve stone into order was to insist that the world could be trusted again. Each pillar was a prayer, each carving a warning, each circle a gathering place where story became ritual. Ritual was the glue that bound communities together. Farming required cooperation. Sowing, tending, harvesting, storing. To live side by side without scattering demanded rules, and rules demanded stories that everyone believed. Religion emerged not as abstraction, but as necessity. To plant was to trust the soil, and trust needed symbols, gods of fertility, spirits of rain, guardians of the sun. The memory of catastrophe shaped these deities. They were not gentle. They were powerful, volatile, capable of destruction if ignored. In Egypt, gods controlled the floods of the Nile. In Mesopotamia, storms were the voices of divine beings. Across cultures, balance was sacred because balance had once been lost. Imagine standing within one of those early stone enclosures at night. Fires flicker, casting animal shadows across the carved pillars. Dozens of people gather, some from nearby villages, some from miles away. They chant, dance, and retell the stories of floods, of winters, of gods who had saved or punished. The air is heavy with smoke and reverence. In that moment, individuals dissolve into community, and memory dissolves into myth. No one needs to ask why the rituals matter. They matter because they remind everyone that survival is not only physical, but spiritual, bound to the lessons of the past. Religion also offered continuity. Each year, rituals marked the cycles of planting and harvest, of solstice and equinox. The sky remained a calendar, but now temples mirrored it, with stones aligned to stars and shadows falling precisely on sacred days. These alignments were not accidents. They were anchors, tying human life to cosmic order. To ignore them was to risk chaos returning, to risk the earth once again turning cold or the seas rising without end. By binding the communities to ritual, people ensured that memory of catastrophe remained alive, even as new generations grew up in warmth and abundance. And with ritual came hierarchy. Some voices carried more authority than others. Elders who remembered famine became advisors. Shamans who interpreted the stars became priests. Those who led rituals became keepers of knowledge, bridging the human and the divine. Authority was no longer only physical. Who could hunt best? Who could defend the village? But spiritual, who could explain why the rains failed or why the harvest succeeded. From this seed, organized religion sprouted, woven inseparably with the first threads of political power. This shift can be seen in the graves of the era. Burials became more elaborate. Some individuals were interred with beads, tools, even offerings of food. Others were laid within stone chambers, suggesting status beyond life. Death itself had become part of ritual, a reminder that community extended beyond the living. To bury an elder beneath a house was to keep their memory in the heart of daily life. A silent guardian reminding each generation of the fragility of existence and the need for unity. The trauma of the Younger Dryas lingered in these practices. Flood myths were retold in rituals of water. Long winters became warnings in rituals of fire. Every harvest festival carried the weight of gratitude born from centuries of hunger. When the Nile rose, Egyptians saw it as both blessing and threat, a delicate balance that had to be honored. When Mesopotamians built ziggurats, they shaped them like mountains, perhaps remembering a time when only mountain peaks had stood above floodwaters. Every act of worship was also an act of memory, a shield against forgetting the chaos that once nearly erased them. Art, too, flourished in this new stability. Pottery bore painted patterns, some abstract, some symbolic, each telling stories in color and form. Figurines of fertility goddesses appeared, their rounded shapes embodying abundance and continuity. Walls were painted with scenes of animals, no longer hunted in desperation, but honored in ritual. These creations were not idle decoration. They were offerings, prayers, reminders that beauty itself was a defense against despair. In clay and pigment, humanity reclaimed not only survival, but joy. Perhaps most importantly, these early centers created something new: shared identity. Before, humans had been scattered bands defined by kinship. Now they were members of larger networks, bound by rituals, stories, and sacred places. A person from one valley could travel miles and still find familiarity in the carvings on a stone, the rhythm of a chant, the orientation of a temple towards the same stars. Civilization was beginning, not through conquest or wealth, but through memory turned into culture. The long winter had stripped humanity down to endurance. The return of warmth allowed humanity to rise again, but always with caution, always with ritual to remind them of what could be lost. Civilization was not an invention of convenience. It was an act of resilience, born from trauma, shaped by the determination to never forget. From scattered villages and sacred gathering sites, something new began to emerge, something larger, more permanent, more ambitious. Humanity, once confined to small bands and seasonal camps, was now shaping entire landscapes into places meant not just for survival, but for continuity. The first cities were not cities as we imagine them today, with walls of stone and bustling markets. They were clusters of homes and shrines bound together by memory, ritual, and the fragile promise of abundance. Yet they carried within them the seed of everything that would follow. Take Jericho, often named the world's oldest city. Around 11,000 years ago, on the banks of a spring in the Jordan Valley, people built more than huts. They constructed stone houses with plastered floors, sturdy enough to last for generations. They raised a massive stone tower, circular and imposing, its steps winding upward in a spiral that led toward the sky. Was it a watchtower, a flood marker, a ritual monument? Perhaps it was all three. For those who built it, the tower stood as proof that memory could be solid, that fear of catastrophe could be met not only with prayer, but with stone. Across Anatolia, at Çatalhöyük, another vision of permanence arose. Thousands of people lived in houses packed so closely that roofs served as streets. Murals decorated the walls, showing hunters, animals, and what some believed to be volcanic eruptions, a memory of fire that still haunted them. Burials took place beneath the floors, binding the living to the dead, ensuring that ancestors remained part of daily life. Here was a community not of dozens, but of thousands, a scale unimaginable during the long winter. And at its heart lay not just survival, but ritual. Shrines filled with figurines and bull skulls suggest that the sacred was woven into every aspect of life. Why did humans gather in such numbers after millennia of smallness? Abundance made it possible, but memory made it necessary. To live together was to create resilience, to pool resources, to ensure that if one family failed, another might help. But it was also to carry forward stories in a way that scattered bands could not. In cities, myths could be told to hundreds at once, rituals performed in spaces designed to magnify their power. The memory of catastrophe became not only personal, but collective, shared by communities large enough to call themselves more than families. Life in these early cities was not easy. Crowding brought disease, labor demanded coordination, and food shortages still threatened. Yet the people endured, perhaps because they believed they were building something more than homes. They were building continuity. Every wall plastered, every mural painted, every tower raised was an answer to the past. The world may collapse again, but we will not scatter. We will endure together. This collective endurance gave rise to new forms of authority. Leaders emerged, not just hunters or elders, but organizers, those who could direct labor, manage storage, oversee rituals. Some were priests, interpreting the will of gods. Others were stewards, ensuring food was shared and disputes resolved. The distinction between sacred and political blurred. To govern was to protect memory, and to protect memory was to govern. The first cities were experiments in weaving power with myth, and though fragile, they set the pattern for civilizations to come. Consider the murals at Çatalhöyük, which show vultures hovering over headless bodies. To modern eyes, they are unsettling. But perhaps they were not depictions of violence, but of ritual, an acknowledgement that death and life are entwined, that memory must be preserved even in decay. These images suggest a world view shaped by catastrophe, where nothing was taken for granted, where every cycle of planting, of life, of death was sacred. In this sense, the The first cities were not merely economic centers. They were theaters of memory, designed to keep alive the lessons of the Younger Dryas, even as warmth and abundance returned. In Jericho, the tower itself may have served as a warning. Its alignment suggests it marked the summer solstice sunset, a way of tracking the passage of time. Some scholars believe it was built to remind each generation of the danger of flood, as though the people of Jericho feared not only hunger, but water rising to erase them once again. If so, the tower was less a fortress than a memory carved in stone, a way of saying, "We remember what happened, and we will not forget." The growth of these early cities also transformed human imagination. To live among thousands was to encounter diversity of skill and thought, to witness artistry beyond necessity. Pottery became more elaborate, walls more carefully decorated, figurines more refined. Storytelling grew richer, myths more layered, rituals more complex. In the press of urban life, ideas collided, blended, and spread. The memory of catastrophe became not only a burden, but an inspiration, fueling creativity as much as caution. And always, the sky remained central. In Çatalhöyük, scholars debate whether certain shrines align to stars. In Jericho, the tower may have been both clock and compass. Across early cities, alignments to solstices and equinoxes suggest a shared obsession, to ensure that the heavens would never again betray them without warning. The trauma of the Younger Dryas had made sky-watching more than sacred. It had made it essential. These first cities remind us that civilization did not begin in innocence. It was born in the shadow of memory, shaped by the desire to prevent loss, to guard against chaos, to ensure that the lessons of collapse endured. Every wall of Jericho, every mural at Çatalhöyük, every pillar at Göbekli Tepe carries that same message. We remember, and because we remember, we endure. Water had always been both friend and enemy. It carved valleys, nourished crops, and quenched thirst. But it also destroyed without warning, swallowing homes and fields in a single night. The survivors of the Younger Dryas carried that paradox into the heart of their settlements. And so, when cities began to grow along the great rivers, it was no accident. People sought out water not in ignorance of its dangers, but in full awareness of its double edge. The Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, and later the Yellow River, all became cradles of civilization, each shaped by the memory that water was both giver and taker of life. In Mesopotamia, where the land between the rivers offered fertile soil, the first city-states rose. Canals and irrigation channels spread like veins, bringing water to fields of barley and wheat. But each year, the floods reminded people that abundance could turn to disaster. Sumerian myths reflect this tension. The gods are described as both generous and wrathful, their tempers mirrored in storms and rivers. The great flood of the Epic of Gilgamesh is not only a tale of destruction, but a memory carried forward, echoing real events when waters rose and lives were swept away. To farm in Mesopotamia was to live with one eye on the harvest and the other on the flood, trusting ritual and prayer to hold back chaos. Egypt, too, was defined by its river. The Nile's annual flood brought rich silt, renewing the soil year after year. But its rhythm was not always kind. A flood too low meant famine. A flood too high meant destruction. Egyptian religion turned this cycle into cosmic order. The gods themselves governed the waters. Osiris, lord of fertility, was tied to the Nile's renewal, while Hapi, the spirit of the flood, was worshipped to ensure balance. Temples aligned to solstices and star risings were more than monuments. They were instruments for predicting the river's moods. The trauma of the past had taught Egyptians to bind their survival to the heavens, so that the Nile's floods might be read as messages rather than mysteries. Farther east, in the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa rose along rivers that could be as destructive as they were fertile. Streets were laid out in grids, drains carried away floodwaters, and storage facilities kept food safe against uncertainty. Archaeologists still marvel at their planning, but perhaps it was less innovation than necessity. To live in a land where floods could erase entire districts was to design cities with memory in mind. Their myths are lost to us, but the orderliness of their settlements whispers the same truth. They remembered, and they prepared. The Yellow River of China carried both life and devastation. Its floods were so unpredictable that it became known as China's sorrow. Early dynasties framed their legitimacy around the ability to control its waters. The great Yu, a legendary figure, was said to have tamed the floods, channeling rivers and saving the people. In this myth, we glimpse not only political power, but memory of catastrophe, an origin story that begins with survival, just as so many others do. To govern was to hold back chaos, to keep water in balance, to prove that humanity could endure where once it had nearly been erased. In each of these river civilizations, religion and politics intertwined with the memory of catastrophe. Kings and priests did not simply manage crops, they stood as mediators between humans and forces that could destroy them. To neglect ritual was to invite disaster. To honor the gods was to hope for stability. The floods themselves became sacred calendars, their cycles tied to festivals and rites. But beneath the rituals lay fear, the knowledge, inherited from the Younger Dryas, that stability could never be guaranteed. Architecture reflected this tension. Ziggurats rose in Mesopotamia like artificial mountains, perhaps recalling the peaks that had once stood above floodwaters. Pyramids in Egypt aligned with stars, anchoring human life to cosmic permanence. Walls were built, not only to defend against enemies, but to resist the encroachment of rivers. Every brick laid was both practical and symbolic, a way of saying, we remember the chaos, and we will not let it take us again. Even writing itself may have been shaped by this inheritance. The earliest tablets record not poetry or philosophy, but lists, grains, rations, debts, offerings, memory carved into clay, resistant to the erasure of flood or famine. To write was to preserve continuity against the threat of forgetting, to ensure that even if catastrophe struck again, knowledge could survive. Perhaps it is no coincidence that the world's first written story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is centered on a flood. The act of writing may have been born not from curiosity, but from fear of loss. Imagine standing on the banks of the Nile at dawn. The waters are rising, creeping into fields where seeds lie buried. Priests in white linen chant hymns to Hapi, while farmers watch with a mixture of reverence and dread. They know that this flood could bring abundance, or it could destroy everything. Behind their rituals lies not only devotion, but memory, the shadow of an age when waters rose uncontrollably, when valleys were drowned, when the world nearly ended. In their ceremonies, they are not only honoring gods, they are speaking to the past, reminding themselves that survival depends on remembering. Civilization, then, was not a rejection of chaos, but a negotiation with it. The great rivers offered abundance, but only if humanity acknowledged their power. Myths of floods, rituals of balance, architectures of permanence, all were responses to the same ancient memory. The Younger Dryas had scarred humanity, but it had also taught a lesson. To endure, we must remember. And in rivers, people saw both the danger and the promise of that lesson. The first great civilizations rose not in defiance of catastrophe, but in its shadow. Their cities were monuments to survival, their myths echoes of disaster, their gods reflections of forces too vast to control. And though their temples still stand in ruins today, they continue to whisper the same truth carved into human memory. The world can change in an instant, and only by honoring the cycles can we hope to endure them. The further humanity moved from the chaos of the Younger Dryas, the more the raw terror of survival softened into reflection. Catastrophe no longer lived only in immediate memory, but in story, myth, and eventually, philosophy. And across cultures, a remarkable pattern emerged. The idea that time was not a straight line, but a circle, an endless cycle of creation and destruction. This way of seeing the world may have been humanity's attempt to make sense of what their ancestors had endured. A recognition that golden ages could end in floods, and floods could give way to rebirth. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians preserved lists of kings divided into two eras, those who ruled before the flood and those who came after. The antediluvian kings reigned for impossibly long spans, tens of thousands of years, suggesting not literal chronology, but memory of a world that felt eternal compared to the fragile one that followed. The flood stood as a dividing wall in time, a reminder that history itself had been interrupted. To the Sumerians, history was not a gradual ascent, but a cycle. Greatness lost, humanity humbled, and then reborn into a lesser, more precarious age. In Egypt, the idea of the Zep Tepi, the first time, permeated their cosmology. It was the age when gods established order, when the world was set in balance. Every ritual, every temple, every pharaoh's rule was a reenactment of that beginning. To Egyptians, time was not progressive, but regenerative. Each year when the Nile flooded, it was both destruction and renewal, a miniature echo of the ancient catastrophe and rebirth. The cycles of flood and harvest were not just natural events. They were symbols of cosmic truth, proof that creation always stood side by side with dissolution. In India, the Vedic tradition embraced cycles with astonishing depth. Time was divided into yugas, vast ages that moved from golden harmony into darkness and destruction, only to reset again. Each cycle spanned millions of years, dwarfing human lifespans, yet carrying the same theme: rise, fall, renewal. The story of Manu, saved from a great flood by a divine fish, sits within this framework, an echo of the Younger Dryas catastrophe woven into a philosophy of eternal recurrence. To the Indian mind, the trauma of sudden change became cosmic law, a pattern woven into the very fabric of existence. Even in Greece, where philosophers sought reason in nature, the idea of cycles persisted. Hesiod spoke of successive ages of humanity: golden, silver, bronze, heroic, and iron. Each age grew darker, weaker, more corrupt, until inevitably destroyed and replaced. Plato, in his dialogues, hinted at civilizations that rose and fell before, their traces lost to floods and fire. Atlantis to him was not merely allegory, but a pattern, a great society undone, leaving behind only myth. The Greek mind, even as it pursued rational inquiry, could not escape the idea that history repeated itself, that catastrophe was not exception, but inevitability. Why did so many cultures converge on this worldview? Perhaps because memory demanded it. The Younger Dryas was not a local disaster. It was global, reshaping climates across continents. Its memory, carried through myths of flood and fire, became universal inheritance. To see time as a straight line of progress would have felt naive to survivors who had watched abundance turn to famine in a single generation. The cycle of growth, collapse, and renewal was a more honest reflection of lived experience. This cyclical vision also shaped ethics. In India, the dark age of Kali Yuga was not just a cosmological statement, but a moral one. Corruption and decline were part of the cycle, and endurance was a virtue. In Egypt, pharaohs were judged not by conquest alone, but by their ability to maintain mahat, the balance of order against chaos. In Mesopotamia, kings sought legitimacy by claiming divine sanction to preserve stability against the ever-present threat of flood and famine. Philosophy, politics, and morality were inseparable from the memory of catastrophe. The cycle also inspired hope. If destruction was inevitable, so was renewal. The flood did not end humanity. It cleansed, reset, and allowed new beginnings. To believe in cycles was to believe in continuity, even if fragile. It reassured people that no matter how dark the present, another dawn would come. Myths of golden ages were not only nostalgia, but promises. What was lost could, in some form, return. Imagine a philosopher in ancient Mesopotamia, gazing at the night sky reflected in canal waters. He knows the stars rise and set in endless repetition, that the moon waxes and wanes, that the rivers flood and recede. To him, it is obvious. Time itself must follow the same pattern. Civilizations rise, civilizations fall, and from their ruins new ones are born. What his eyes see in the heavens, his memory confirms on the earth. The Younger Dryas had proven it once. It would happen again. This philosophy still echoes today. We speak of history repeating itself, of cycles of boom and collapse, of golden ages and dark ages. Our myths of apocalypse, whether fire, flood, or ice, are less predictions than inheritances, carried from ancestors who lived through their own apocalypse. We fear endings, but we also expect rebirth. In every vision of destruction lies the seed of renewal. That dual vision is not modern. It is ancient, born in the long winter, and carried forward ever since. Civilization's philosophies were not abstractions built in quiet halls. They were survival lessons written into worldview. The Egyptians built pyramids not to defy time, but to align themselves with its eternal cycle. The Indians spoke of yugas because they remembered a time when the world had ended and begun again. The Greeks spoke of Atlantis because their myths still carried the shadow of a flood. Everywhere, memory became cosmology, and cosmology became philosophy. The cycle of creation and destruction was not a pessimistic view. It was resilience codified into thought. It told humanity that even if the world fell apart again, and it surely would, life would continue, memory would endure, and from the ashes of catastrophe, a new age would rise. This is the lesson of the Younger Dryas, transformed into philosophy, carved into myth, whispered into ritual. Endings are never final. They are beginnings in disguise. Civilizations, once they grew beyond villages and river towns, carried with them not only the hunger for survival, but also the hunger for permanence. The memory of collapse still lingered in their myths and rituals, and so their greatest works were not simply practical, they were declarations against impermanence. To raise stone high into the sky was to defy the floods, the winters, the chaos that had once humbled them. Empires, in their rise, were built not only from conquest but from memory, and their monuments were both defenses and prayers against the cycles of destruction. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats rose from the plains like artificial mountains. Their stair-stepped sides climbed toward the heavens, linking earth to sky, mortal to divine. But beneath their religious symbolism lay another meaning. They were mountains of memory. When the flood had swallowed valleys, only peaks had remained above the waters. To build a ziggurat was to recreate that sanctuary, to ensure that if chaos came again, something would endure. People gathered in their shadows not just for worship, but for reassurance, seeing in brick and bitumen the permanence that flesh could not guarantee. Egypt took this vision further. Along the Nile, pyramids pierced the horizon, vast stone bodies aligned to the stars. Officially, they were tombs for pharaohs, gateways to the afterlife. But in their form and alignment, they were also cosmic anchors, binding the rhythm of heaven to the soil of earth. To carve millions of blocks, to haul them into shape, to lock them in place with such precision was to speak directly to time itself. We remember the flood, we remember the chaos, and we will not be erased again. The pyramid was not only a tomb, but a weapon against forgetting. The same impulse can be seen in China's Great Walls and India's temple complexes, in the stone circles of Europe and the terraces of the Andes. Each in their own way was an attempt to fix human presence into landscapes that memory knew could shift without warning. Walls were raised against chaos, temples aligned to cycles of sun and moon, terraces carved into mountains to tame the fickleness of soil and rain. Civilizations did not trust the world to remain steady. They sought to steady it themselves, one stone, one brick, one ritual at a time. Imagine a worker hauling stones for the Great Pyramid under the scorching Egyptian sun. Sweat runs down his back, dust fills his lungs, and yet each block he places feels like a prayer. He knows hunger, he knows drought, he knows the whispers of flood. But here, in the stone beneath his hands, he feels permanence. He feels that even if chaos returns, even if the Nile fails or storms rise, this monument will stand. His labor is not only for the pharaoh, but for memory, for the promise that humanity's story will not be washed away again. Empires carried this obsession with permanence into every aspect of their rule. Laws were carved into stone, etched onto clay tablets, inscribed into monuments. To write on perishable material was not enough. Memory needed harder vessels. Hammurabi's code, chiseled into basalt, was more than law. It was a declaration that justice, order, and continuity could withstand the floods of time. Across cultures, rulers sought to inscribe themselves into eternity, not because they believed they were immortal, but because they feared the forgetting that catastrophe had once imposed. Yet beneath every monument lurked irony. The cycles could not truly be stopped. Cities fell, empires collapsed, pyramids crumbled, ziggurats sank into mud. Still, the impulse endured. Each new empire, aware of the ruins left by the old, built higher, stronger, more ambitious. The ruins themselves became warnings, reminders that memory must be carved deeper, built grander, aligned closer with the heavens. The more the past whispered of collapse, the more loudly the present spoke in stone. Philosophers of Greece and Rome debated permanence and impermanence, but their empires too raised monuments, temples of marble, amphitheaters of stone, roads stretching across continents. To build was to resist the cycle, even as they acknowledged it in myth. The Romans spoke of eternal Rome, yet they inherited the memory of Atlantis, of Troy, of kingdoms swallowed by time. Their architecture, like that of every empire before them, was both triumph and anxiety carved into the earth. The obsession with permanence also shaped religion. Temples became cosmic machines designed to endure, to channel the rhythms of heaven into the frailty of earth. Festivals were tied to solstices, eclipses, and floods, ensuring that memory of cycles lived on. Priests interpreted not only the will of gods, but the signs of time, warning of imbalance, prescribing rituals to hold chaos at bay. Religion was not separate from empire. It was the scaffolding upon which empire built its permanence. Without ritual, monuments were only stone. With ritual, they became vessels of memory. And still the people who labored beneath these monuments carried their own, quieter rituals. In homes and fields, they whispered flood myths, passed down prayers, painted symbols onto pottery. Their memory did not need towers or pyramids to survive. It lived in story, in song, in the simple act of planting seeds and trusting the cycle of life to renew itself. The great monuments may have been the empire's defense against forgetting, but the small rituals of daily life were humanity's truer shield. So we see a paradox. The empires sought eternity in stone, but stone itself eroded. What endured was not always the monuments, but the myths, not the walls, but the stories. The Younger Dryas had taught humanity that nothing was permanent, that even golden ages could be erased. Empires tried to answer with permanence, but in the end, the cycle always prevailed. And yet their effort was not in vain. The pyramids still stand, the ziggurats still rise in ruins, the walls still snake across mountains. They endure enough to remind us of their builders' defiance, their desperate hope to hold back time. Civilization, in its grandeur, was always haunted by its fragility. Every empire rose with the memory of collapse whispering in its ear. Every stone laid was both a triumph and an admission. We know this world can fall apart, but we will build as if it cannot. And in that contradiction lies the essence of humanity. Fragile, fearful, yet endlessly ambitious, determined to carve permanence into a world that has never promised it. When catastrophe becomes memory, it does not survive only as fear. It also re-emerges as story, and in those stories, humanity finds figures who embody resilience. Across cultures, myths tell of heroes who stood against chaos, who defied floods, who faced monsters born of destruction. These heroes are more than entertainment. They are reflections of survival, embodiments of the strength that carried humanity through the long winter and the rising seas. In Mesopotamia, Gilgamesh confronts not only beasts, but the inevitability of flood and death. His quest for immortality ends in failure, but his journey preserves a deeper truth. Endurance lies not in living forever, but in remembering. His encounter with Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, connects his story to the ancient catastrophe. The hero learns what his people had always known, that survival depends on memory, and that memory is a kind of immortality. In Greece, heroes faced monsters that were more than creatures. They were symbols of chaos. Heracles wrestled lions, hydras, and boars, but his labors read like allegories of taming a world once untamed. Perseus slayed Medusa, whose gaze turned life to stone. Perhaps a metaphor for death so sudden it froze entire worlds. These stories, though wrapped in drama, carried echoes of catastrophe. Heroes were those who fought back against the forces that had once overwhelmed humanity, restoring order where there had been only ruin. In India, avatars of Vishnu descend whenever chaos threatens to engulf the world. Matsya, the fish, saves Manu from the flood. Rama battles the demon Ravana to restore Dharma. Krishna guides Arjuna through the moral collapse of war. Each avatar is not only a savior, but a reminder that when cycles reach their darkest, renewal is inevitable. Heroes here are not just fighters, but cosmic restorers, embodiments of the cycle itself, destruction followed by order. Among the Norse, Ragnarok is foretold as the ultimate catastrophe. Fire and flood swallowing the world, gods and monsters locked in fatal battle. Yet even here, the story ends not with despair, but with rebirth. Survivors emerge, a new world rises, and the cycle begins again. Heroes like Thor and Odin fall, but their fall ensures that continuity remains. For the Norse, as for so many others, catastrophe was not final. It was the stage upon which renewal was performed, with heroes at its heart. Why do these myths converge on figures who defy destruction? Perhaps because humanity needed more than warnings. Fear alone cannot sustain. To endure, people needed models of defiance, stories that said, yes, the flood came, the fire fell, the ice returned, but someone resisted. Someone survived. Heroes embodied that truth, turning memory of suffering into inspiration. They were less about individuals and more about the collective spirit of resilience. These stories also served another purpose. They transformed trauma into meaning. To say that chaos is random is unbearable. To say that chaos is fought and overcome is empowering. Heroes reframed catastrophe not as senseless cruelty, but as a challenge, a battle to be faced. The long winter was no longer just endurance. It became the tale of those who stood against frost giants or cosmic demons. The floods were no longer just drowning. They became battles survived by ark builders and saviors. In this transformation, humanity found dignity in suffering and hope in survival. Consider the figure of the culture hero, common in traditions worldwide. In the Americas, the Hopi speak of Masa, the caretaker who guided survivors after a flood. In Polynesia, Maui fished islands out of the sea, gifting stability to his people. In Africa, trickster figures like Anansi wove order out of chaos with cunning. These heroes were not conquerors but teachers, figures who brought fire, seeds, or stories, tools of resilience that made survival possible. They embody the lesson that catastrophe does not only destroy, it also demands ingenuity, and from ingenuity comes culture. Even when heroes are punished, as Prometheus was for stealing fire, their suffering speaks to memory. The gift of fire is dangerous, yes, but it is also essential. The gods may chain the giver, but the gift remains, carried forward by humanity. In this way, myths reassure us that knowledge, once given, cannot be erased. Even in collapse, what has been learned survives in some form. Heroes thus become bridges between ages, figures who carry fragments of lost worlds into new ones. Imagine a child listening to such stories by firelight. Outside, winds rattle the walls of a hut, or waves crash on a distant shore. The child hears of floods that drowned the world, of monsters slain, of gods who punished and restored. These are not fairy tales to the listener. They are instructions, encoded in narrative, telling them, the world is fragile, but we are strong. Chaos will return, but so will renewal. In that child's imagination, fear is tempered with courage, and memory becomes hope. The universality of heroes suggests something profound. Across continents, cultures that never met crafted similar figures, each standing against overwhelming forces, each embodying resilience. This is not coincidence. It is shared memory, refracted through myth. The Younger Dryas may not be named in their stories, but its shadow is there, in the floods, in the fires, in the endless battles against chaos. Humanity, fractured by geography, united in memory, and in that memory heroes rose as the voices of endurance. The cycle of catastrophe and rebirth demanded more than warnings. It demanded symbols of triumph. Heroes became those symbols, their stories carried through millennia, ensuring that even in times of abundance, no one forgot the truth. The world can end, but humanity can endure. And so long as we tell the stories of heroes, we keep alive the resilience that once carried us through the darkest winters and the highest floods. When we speak of technology today, we think of progress, of invention for its own sake. But in the deep past, in the shadow of the Younger Dryas, technology was born not from ambition, but from fear. Every innovation was an answer to catastrophe, a way to build defenses against hunger, flood, and cold. Farming, architecture, astronomy, all emerged not as luxuries of abundance, but as shields forged from memory. The first fields of wheat and barley were not planted by dreamers imagining empire, but by survivors who remembered famine. To bend over the soil, to scatter seeds, to guard shoots from birds, this was an act of resistance against the endless winters their ancestors had endured. It was a promise to future generations. Never again shall we rely only on chance, on the fickle return of herds or the mercy of forests. Farming tethered survival to the earth itself, creating cycles humans could control, even if imperfectly. In every field lay memory, the silent echo of hunger that had once hollowed entire families. Architecture, too, carried the weight of memory. The first permanent homes were not only shelters from rain, but bulwarks against chaos. Walls grew thicker, roofs sturdier, not because abundance required them, but because catastrophe had taught fragility. Storage pits deepened, silos rose, granaries multiplied. To stockpile grain was not greed. It was insurance against a world that could turn cruel without warning. At Jericho, the great stone tower was more than architecture. It was memory in masonry, a monument to vigilance, built to outlast storms, floods, and perhaps even time itself. Astronomy may seem the most abstract of technologies, but it too was born from survival. To track the stars was to predict seasons, to know when floods would come, when to plant, when to harvest. But beneath its practicality lay trauma. The sky had once rained fire, or so survivors believed, and comets burned across memory as omens of destruction. To watch the heavens was not curiosity alone. It was dread. Every alignment, every solstice, every eclipse was scrutinized as a possible sign of return. The observatories of the ancient world, whether stone circles or desert alignments, were less temples of wonder than early warning systems, carved into culture by fear of forgetting. These technologies were not isolated. They wove together into the first true civilizations. Farming allowed surplus. Surplus allowed specialists. Specialists built temples. Temples aligned to stars. Stars dictated farming again. It was a loop, a feedback system designed to hold back chaos. The trauma of the Younger Dryas had taught that survival required more than endurance. It required foresight, structure, and the deliberate preservation of knowledge. Every innovation was a memory turned into method. Even writing, humanity's greatest invention, carried this inheritance. The earliest tablets recorded not poems but lists. Grain rations, debts, offerings. They were tools to ensure fairness in times of scarcity, to keep order when abundance faltered. To inscribe memory into clay was to declare that knowledge itself would not be washed away by flood or forgotten in famine. Writing was not born in luxury, but in fear, a bulwark against the chaos that had once nearly erased humanity. Consider the myths of the gods who brought knowledge: Prometheus with fire, Oannes with writing, Quetzalcoatl with maize. These stories may not describe divine intervention, but human innovation reframed as sacred. The survivors of catastrophe, carrying fragments of forgotten techniques, may have seemed like gods to those who had endured only scarcity. Their gifts, fire, farming, writing, were more than tools. They were weapons against oblivion, each one designed to ensure that when the cycle turned again, humanity would be better prepared. But technology is never neutral. With stability came hierarchy. Those who controlled farming controlled food. Those who built monuments controlled memory. Those who read the sky or inscribed tablets controlled the future. The memory of catastrophe was preserved, but it was also weaponized. Kings claimed divine right to maintain balance. Priests declared themselves mediators between gods and floods. Scribes held secrets of writing as power. Technology, born from survival, became the foundation of authority. Yet even in the hands of rulers, its core purpose remained unchanged: to guard against chaos, to preserve what memory warned could always return. Imagine a farmer at dawn in the early Neolithic. He kneels to plant barley in rows, each seed a quiet defiance against hunger. Nearby, masons shape stone into walls that will not fall with the next storm. And in the distance, elders gather around pillars aligned to stars, calculating the turning of seasons. None of them think of themselves as inventors. They are simply remembering. Their hands, their tools, their rituals are extensions of stories told around fires. That once the world betrayed them, and that they must never be unprepared again. This is the hidden root of civilization. It did not emerge from ease but from catastrophe. Farming was born from famine, architecture from fear, astronomy from uncertainty, writing from the dread of forgetting. Each technology carries within it the ghost of disaster, transformed into resilience. The Younger Dryas ended long ago, but its shadow lingers in every field we plow, every wall we raise, every star we track. We still build, still plan, still calculate as though preparing for another collapse. Perhaps it is instinct. Perhaps it is memory written so deeply into us that we cannot shake it. Technology, then, is not only progress, it is memory solidified, trauma transformed into method. Civilization is not a triumph over chaos, but a negotiation with it, a fragile balance held together by tools, rituals, and stories. We invent not to conquer the world, but to endure it. And in every invention lies the same quiet plea carried from the long winter. Let us never be caught unprepared again. Even as civilizations flourished, as fields ripened and cities gleamed with temples and palaces, the shadow of catastrophe never disappeared. It lingered in myths and rituals, in whispered warnings, and in the very architecture of the sacred. And when religions began to take shape, they inherited this memory, reshaping it into prophecies of the future. What had once been history became destiny. The floods and fires of the Younger Dryas were no longer only stories of the past. They became visions of what would come again. In the Hebrew tradition, the story of Noah's flood is framed not as myth alone, but as judgment, a divine act meant to cleanse the earth. The waters that once drowned valleys became a moral lesson. Corruption leads to destruction, obedience to survival. Yet beneath the theology lies memory, the image of an ark riding above endless waters, carrying seeds of life to a new age, echoes older stories from Mesopotamia and beyond. It is not invention, but transformation, the retelling of catastrophe in the language of faith. The Christian tradition carried this inheritance further. The Book of Revelation describes not only spiritual conflict, but cosmic upheaval. Stars falling from the sky, seas turning to blood, the world consumed by fire before a new heaven and earth are revealed. To believers, these were visions of the end. But to historians, they may be memories of the beginning, the fire and flood of ancient catastrophe reframed as prophecy. Apocalypse, in this sense, is not merely prediction, but memory turned forward, a way of saying, what has happened before will happen again. In Islam, too, the Quran speaks of floods, earthquakes, and fire as signs of divine judgment. Entire peoples are destroyed for their arrogance, cities erased for their defiance. Each tale reinforces the same lesson. Human order is fragile, divine order eternal. To live is to remember that catastrophe is never far away, and only obedience provides shelter. These stories, though given theological meaning, carry the same ancient rhythm. Destruction followed by renewal, chaos giving way to balance. In India, the cycles of yugas already framed history as endless recurrence. The Kali Yuga, the age of darkness, was expected to end in fire and flood, paving the way for a new Satya Yuga, a golden age of truth. Here, apocalypse is not punishment, but inevitability, an endless turning of the wheel. This philosophy may be the most honest reflection of the Younger Dryas memory. Collapse is not anomaly, but pattern, and survival lies in accepting the cycle, preparing for it, and trusting in renewal. Among the Norse, Ragnarok is prophecy, but also memory. The fire giant Surtur, the wolf Fenrir, the serpent Jormungandr, all unleash destruction that ends the world of gods and men. Yet even in this annihilation, new life emerges. Survivors walk into a renewed world, green and fertile, as though the long winter has ended once more. In Ragnarok, we hear the echo of floods and fires remembered in northern lands, reshaped into myth, then into prophecy. Why do religions hold so tightly to apocalyptic visions? Perhaps because catastrophe left scars too deep to heal. Even in times of abundance, humanity remembered the fragility of stability. Fields could wither, rivers could rise, stars could fall. By embedding apocalypse into theology, religions preserved this truth for every generation. It was no longer only elders warning children by firelight. It became scripture, ritual, prophecy, an institution of memory. But apocalypse is never only destruction. It always carries renewal. Noah's Ark lands on dry ground. Revelation promises a new heaven and earth. Hindu cycles turn darkness into golden dawn. Ragnarok ends with a fertile plain. Even in Islam, after destruction comes paradise. The memory of catastrophe was too devastating to hold without hope. Religions softened it with promise, transforming trauma into moral lesson and spiritual renewal. Humanity could accept destruction if it also meant rebirth. Consider a congregation in ancient Jerusalem, listening as a scribe reads the story of Noah. Outside, rains patter against rooftops, a reminder of the fragility of life. The listeners shiver, imagining waters rising to swallow their world. Yet they also feel reassurance. God preserved Noah, and so too will he preserve the faithful. What began as memory of flood has become comfort, the fear tempered by promise. Religion thus became not only a vessel for memory, but a balm for the wound catastrophe left. Even in secular thought, the apocalyptic inheritance persists. Philosophers speak of cycles, poets of worlds ending in fire or ice, historians of empires rising and falling. The language may change, but the rhythm is the same. The memory of the Younger Dryas still whispers in our imagination, shaping our fears of collapse, our visions of the future. Every prediction of doom, every tale of renewal is an echo of that long winter, carried through religions into our present. The great irony is that apocalypse, far from being the end, has been a source of endurance. By expecting collapse, civilizations prepared for it. By imagining destruction, they created resilience. Apocalypse stories became cultural rehearsal, training humanity to face what it feared most. And in that rehearsal, survival was strengthened. Myths did not only preserve memory, they prepared the future. So when we read scriptures that speak of floods, fires, and endings, we are not only reading theology, we are hearing the voices of ancestors who lived through catastrophe, who refused to let memory die, who transformed trauma into prophecy so that we would never forget. Apocalypse is not prediction alone. It is the echo of history, a warning written in sacred words, carried across millennia, reminding us that the world can end, and that when it does, life will begin again. Civilization, as we know it, was not born from peace. It was born from fear, from memory, from the determination of survivors who refused to let the lessons of catastrophe fade. Every field plowed, every temple raised, every myth retold was a whisper across millennia. We remember. The Younger Dryas was long ago, yet its shadow still stretches across our world. We live in its aftermath, in the civilizations it forced into being, in the rituals it carved into culture, in the stories it carried into faith. Look at the monuments of our ancestors, and you see more than ambition. You see anxiety turned to stone. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the pyramids of Egypt, the temples of India, the walls of China, the megaliths of Europe, all are echoes of the same fear, that the world could unravel again. Their grandeur is not only glory, it is defiance. Every block laid was a vow against forgetting, a refusal to let chaos swallow memory. Listen to the myths, and you hear not only invention, but survival encoded in story. Floods, fires, golden ages, heroes, saviors, each tale is a vessel carrying fragments of truth. They tell us that humanity has lived through endings before, that destruction is never final, that renewal always follows. Myths are not lies. They are memories wrapped in metaphor, carried safely through time like seeds awaiting fertile soil. Watch the stars, and you see the same pattern. The constellations we trace are older than cities, older than writing. They were drawn by people who looked upward in fear and hope, searching for signs that the world would not betray them again. Astronomy began not as science, but as survival. The sky a canvas of memory, each star a reminder that order persists even when Earth falters. Even today we inherit this legacy. Our apocalyptic fears, whether of fire, flood, or ice, are not new. They are ancient memories, resurfacing in modern forms. Climate change, nuclear war, pandemics, each fear is a reflection of the same truth. Civilization is fragile, stability uncertain. We carry the past within us, even if we no longer name it. The Younger Dryas still whispers in our bones. And yet, just as our ancestors did, we answer fear with resilience. We build, we plant, we write, we dream. Our technologies are more complex now, but at their heart they serve the same purpose: to guard against collapse, to preserve memory, to endure. The impulse is the same as it was in the first farmer scattering barley, the first mason shaping stone, the first shaman aligning pillars to stars. We remember, and because we remember, we prepare. Perhaps that is humanity's truest inheritance: not wealth, not empire, not even knowledge, but memory. Memory that catastrophe is real, but so is survival. Memory that the world can fall apart, but life continues. Memory that endings are never absolute, but beginnings in disguise. This is what myths teach, what monuments declare, what rituals preserve. It is what allowed us to step from the long winter into fields of wheat, from scattered bands into cities, from silence into civilization. And so we come to the present, thousands of years later, still telling the same stories: the flood, the fire, the hero, the savior, the renewal. We tell them not because they are fantasy, but because they are true in the deepest sense. They are the memory of our species, the script of our survival. Without them, we would forget. And to forget would be to risk living unprepared when the cycle turns again. Imagine yourself now, lying in the quiet of night. The hum of the modern world surrounds you, yet beyond the walls, the stars still rise as they did for your ancestors. They looked up and saw omens, warnings, comfort. You look up and see constellations, galaxies, infinities. But beneath both gazes lies the same question: how fragile is our world? How long will our abundance last before the cycle turns? Will our monuments endure, or will they too become ruins, whispers for some future civilization to puzzle over? The story of humanity is not one of certainty. It is one of memory, of resilience, of cycles endured and retold. We are heirs to survivors, and their whispers still guide us. The world has ended before, and it will end again, but endings are never final. They are thresholds, invitations to begin anew. And so, as the night deepens and the stars drift overhead, let the question linger in your mind: not heavy with fear, but soft with wonder. If another cycle comes, if the world changes again, what memory of us will remain?